There are some articles in international law that, if used today, could trigger a major world war in just a few hours. A United Nations Charter. It was established 80 years ago and is still in effect. It still gives certain countries the legal right to strike other countries without anyone's permission. But what's strange about all this today is that the world has changed, the powers have changed, the economy has changed. In fact, everything in this world has changed recently, while international laws are still stuck in Hitler's era, still stuck in the time right after World War II. So today, in this episode, we will reveal to you how the United Nations Charter has become a ticking time bomb, because there are countries that refuse change, and as a result, the whole world is being pushed toward a major war. How is that? This is what we will reveal today. Stay tuned after the break. Dear viewers, peace be upon you and God's mercy and blessings, and welcome to you today in this renewed meeting, God willing, from the series of episodes of Opinion Today. Dear viewers, although all the countries of the world are members of the United Nations, and although there is an international charter at the United Nations that is considered one of the foundations of international law, still a very large percentage, we could say, the vast majority of people have not read this charter. We read history, we read geography, we read economics, we read everything related to the world wars that this world has known. While we overlook the most important thing that came after the end of World War II, which is the United Nations Charter, the charter that defined the world order after the end of World War II. So today we will address a very important topic related to this charter and related to one of the most important points that came in this charter, and which China could possibly exploit today in this major conflict that is starting to emerge against Japan. For example, there are a number of articles in this charter, such as Article 53, Article 77, and Article 107. All of them are articles, and they give the right to a group of countries that won World War II, such as America, Russia, and China, the right to use force without the approval of the United Nations Security Council, against all the countries that were known as the Axis powers, against all the countries that formed Hitler's alliance. And by that, who are we talking about? We're talking about Germany, we're talking about Italy, about Japan, meaning that today, if Russia wanted to strike Germany, or if it wanted to strike Italy, it could. That would be without the approval of the United Nations Security Council. And the same goes for China, which could strike Japan today as well, without the approval of the United Nations Security Council. So this United Nations Charter, which was originally created as the victorious countries of the World War wanted, they kept these powers because these countries did not trust the Axis powers, like Germany, Italy, or others. That means they kept these powers so they could strike these countries at any moment. If they turned against America, the world order, or similar things, some people, maybe when they hear this information, will say, so what? Why didn't Russia strike Germany, which is waging a proxy war against it in Ukraine? Why didn't it hit Finland? Finland, which decided to join NATO against the Russians, why didn't it strike the Baltic states as well? All of them were countries that were part of the Axis powers. So Russia could use the United Nations Charter to strike these countries without going back to the United Nations Security Council. The truth is, this was actually possible, but that's exactly what the West wanted. And this is what Russia has avoided all these past years, because Russia doesn't want to open other battlefronts, it doesn't want to scatter its military, supply, and logistical capabilities, and so on. Russia says if this war expands with the Europeans, it will be a completely different war from what it is in Ukraine. This is a hint that it would be a nuclear war. So if Russia uses these articles of the United Nations Charter, it will enter a major war, and then it will be World War III, especially since these countries now, as everyone knows, are members of NATO. They have become members of NATO. So how can a country that is a member of the world's strongest military alliance And yet, in the eyes of the United Nations, according to this charter, they are still considered Hitler's legacy. These countries can be attacked without the approval of the United Nations Security Council. Therefore, this means that this charter has become outdated and time has passed it by. It no longer has any usefulness today. And we also see this even between China and Japan. It is clear today that China can strike Japan whenever it wants, according to this charter. Recently, just a few days ago, the Chinese embassy in Japan talked about this right granted by international law. And they stated clearly that China reserved this right, meaning it can use it at any time whenever it deems necessary. But here we find the same thing. Japan is a partner of NATO, and Japan is one of America's most important allies. Therefore, this makes China avoid this scenario, fearing American intervention and the risk of a major war. Therefore, there are articles in the United Nations Charter that have become outdated and are no longer binding or applicable today. So the need to reform the United Nations is raised, and the most important reform within the United Nations is updating this United Nations Charter. But here, of course, there are countries that benefit from this charter, countries that benefit from this situation, and they refuse any reform, any update, or any change to the situation. Why? Because they benefit from this situation, like countries such as France and Britain. These countries in reality no longer deserve to be inside the United Nations Security Council. These countries, when they established the United Nations Security Council, they had very wide influence in the world. They controlled the entire African continent, they controlled the Middle East, they controlled Canada, India, Australia, and so on, including other countries and islands. But today, their influence has diminished. Their influence has declined significantly. Therefore, today, if the United Nations Security Council were to be restructured logically, there wouldn't be any seat for France or Britain. Even Trump, as I showed you in the previous episode, even Trump today is planning to establish a new world government, and the group of 5 does not include any European countries. Why? Because they no longer have, and he knows very well, they no longer have global weight that allows them this status. Today, there are new powers in this world, stronger than these countries, that deserve to be in France's place, that deserve to be in Britain's place. There are countries like India, Japan, South Korea, and countries like Turkey. These countries now have very wide influence, in various parts of the world. The United Nations Security Council can't remain like this without these new powers, relying on countries and excluding others. Over time, it has lost the weight it used to have in the past. Today, the world has changed. No one can stand in the way of China. Pay close attention to mentioning China. This is a very important point. If America records an annual trade deficit exceeding $1 trillion, more than $1,000 billion, then this year China has a trade surplus exceeding $1 trillion, more than $1,000 billion. Just imagine with me what China will look like in the next few years. Every year, China is now making a profit of $1,000 billion from its international trade, while America is losing $1,000 billion every year. So what everyone needs to know is that China is achieving these numbers and these massive exports to the world thanks to a number of factors, the most important of which is the weakness of its local currency. The Chinese yuan is actually in reality a strong currency that could surpass the dollar and the euro at any moment. This currency is very strong, not weak. China manipulates its real value in order to maintain this commercial development. Imagine with me that a great and powerful country like China achieves all these commercial and economic figures and today offers loans to almost every country in the world. And in the end, its local currency is weak, its value is declining. Does that make sense? For example, the value of the yuan against the euro has declined by 7.5% this year, and since 2023 until today, it has dropped by 18% against all global currencies. Does that make sense logically? Is that reasonable? Logically, The Chinese yuan is worth about 1.30 dirhams in Moroccan currency, 1.30 dirhams. Does that make sense? There has definitely been some manipulation recently. The European Chamber of Commerce criticized China, saying that it is artificially manipulating its real value. The American International Monetary Fund also made the same accusations against China. China keeps the value of its currency low so that it can manufacture products at very low prices, making it impossible for any country in the world to compete with it internationally. Therefore, it always ensures demand for its products and guarantees a continuous increase in its exports to the world. But what's strange is that China officially admits this. China says this isn't manipulation. It actually says there is, a devaluation or control of the currency, but it's not manipulation. It's not a conspiracy. They say this is done officially. It's an official policy adopted by the People's Bank of China in managing the exchange rate of the yuan. They admit this, and almost every country in the world has different policies for managing their own currency's exchange rate. There are countries that implement policies to keep the value of their currency low, and there are others that do the opposite, implementing policies to keep their currency high or stable within certain limits. So the Chinese yuan is not pegged to just one currency like the United States dollar. It's pegged to the dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, the British pound, and a group of other currencies. So in reality, this is not necessarily called manipulation, but rather a policy to control the exchange rate. Of course, this angers the Europeans, and they call it manipulation and so on. The Europeans have failed miserably on all levels, and they blame this failure on China's manipulation of its local currency value, while there are other factors that they ignore. The most important factor, for example today, is the blackmail involving products, technologies, industries, and so on, many different products. If it weren't for China, no people from the third world countries would have known about it. Europe had monopolized it for decades to make civilization possible. That's all. At that time, they were the ones who owned televisions, refrigerators, and so on. They monopolized such products and sold them at high prices, even though they were the ones who brought globalization, liberalism, and so on. And they imposed sanctions and blackmail on countries. If you want us to sell you this product so it can be available in your markets, you have to meet these conditions. For example, you have to support and promote Western culture in your country. You have to allow the spread of homosexuality in your country, things like that. So when China came, it didn't just bring cheap products, it also brought products to sell to you. Without imposing any conditions, without interfering in internal affairs, its goal was purely commercial. Recently, for example, European car companies withdrew from Russia. Europe imposed sanctions on Russia because of the war in Ukraine, so these European car companies pulled out. Europe basically told Russia, we will not sell cars to Russia. They thought that Russia would collapse internally because of this. They believed it would get into trouble. Maybe they thought it would go back to the era of horse-drawn carriages or something like that. But in reality, what happened? They left the market open for Chinese cars. China saw the opportunity and sold cars to the Russians worth hundreds of millions of dollars in just 3 years. Today, China controls the car market in Russia. Even if this European company wanted to return to the Russian market now, it wouldn't be able to because of China's dominance in Russia today. So the Europeans are the ones ruining their own interests with such wrong policies. There are, many reasons, many causes. The reasons behind this trade surplus for China are not just the weakness of the Chinese yuan. For example, we also find differences in culture between the Chinese people and Europeans or Americans. The Chinese people are not a consumerist people. Even though they make everything, they don't consume everything, unlike Europeans and Americans. They have been transformed over many decades through media and cultural influence into a consumerist people who consume everything. The truth is that the West in general has woken up, but it woke up at a very late time. They found that China no longer needs America or the European countries. It no longer depends on these countries. And as a result, it has reached a level where it is impossible to impose conditions on China. Some European countries, like France, for example, Macron, as we saw recently when he visited China, these countries still haven't understood yet. China has become an independent superpower. It's not a colony, not a European sphere of influence. In the past, China was under British influence, that was before. But today things are turning around, and Europe is becoming a sphere of Chinese influence. Just imagine, China has investments in Europe today that exceed $3 trillion. That's more than $3,000 billion, a huge number. They have companies in Europe, they have major shares in the biggest European companies in various sectors like automobiles, parts, fertilizers, agriculture, and so on. It's not just due to the weakness of the Chinese yuan, as people say. If Europe could lower the value of the euro, they would have done it. Those who criticize China, if they could do the same thing with the euro, they would have done it, but in reality, they simply can't do it at all. Because there is no political consensus among the European Union countries to lower the value of the euro. Some countries want that, like France, Italy, and Spain, because they benefit from lowering the value of the euro, but there are other countries that refuse to do that, because it would harm countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and others. That's the key point. So, in summary, today the world has changed, and it is still changing very quickly. These countries cannot remain in their previous positions. There are countries that no longer deserve to be in the United Nations Security Council, while there are other countries that strongly deserve it today. There are countries today that you can no longer talk to in a dictatorial or condescending tone, as it was in the past. These countries now have status, they have influence, and today they have power. Technology is no longer monopolized by a few, as it was in the past. Today it is available to everyone. The same goes for military industries, and the same applies to this transformation in military power, which no longer relies on the same old traditional weapons. There is a very significant change happening in the world, and I believe this change must reach all laws and all international charters. But the question always remains, is it possible for the world to witness this comprehensive change without a major war? I don't think so. Answer us in the comments below this video, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Peace be upon you, and God's mercy and blessings. See you next time.